The steering wheel felt slick beneath her fingertips, but she refused to loosen her grip. For hours she had kept her hands locked in place, guiding the old station wagon across a highway that shimmered under the weight of the August sun. The air inside had grown thick and stale ever since the air conditioner surrendered miles back, but she no longer bothered with the windows. The wind had turned into a harsh blast of heat and dust, scraping her throat raw each time she tried to breathe. Heat pressed against her like a second skin. The horizon stretched forever, a cruel line she kept chasing but never reached. Anyone who had crossed Texas in late summer knew it didn't care who you were or what burden you carried. It simply burned and kept burning. But today she told herself the suffering was worth it. This drive wasn't like the others. Today, what she had in the back seat mattered more than comfort, more than fear, more than the rules she had lived by her entire life. She flicked her eyes to the mirror. The faded brown blanket lay across the seat exactly where she had placed it. Underneath it, small and silent, was the reason she would not stop until New Mexico. "We're almost there, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft and steady, as if she were reciting a bedtime lullaby. "A little longer and we'll find some cool air, some peace, somewhere no one can hurt you." Silence, not even a stir. "Good girl," she whispered. "Such a good, brave girl." Her voice carried a conviction she hadn't expected. She had assumed she would tremble with doubt, feel the weight of what she had done pressing into her bones. But her hands were steady, her heartbeat calm. Somewhere deep inside, her mind had already settled on the truth days ago. This wasn't wickedness. It wasn't disobedience. It was salvation. The certainty had brought with it a strange, quiet relief. 3 years worth of notes sat inside a worn notebook back in her apartment. Dates, incidents, late-night arguments, strange men slipping in and out of Rita Sandoval's doorway, and a child left alone for hours that stretched far too long. Page after page, she had gathered the kind of evidence that prosecutors dreamed of. Rita had no business raising a daughter, and Amy deserved someone who would actually show up. The moment of decision hadn't been cinematic. There had been no dramatic music, no flash of rage, just a tiny click inside her chest, a soft, almost gentle locking into place, when, at 2 a.m, Rita appeared at her door smelling of sweat, bourbon, and someone else's cologne. She had watched Rita leave again, watched her stagger down the concrete walkway toward her apartment. And then she moved. She had lifted Amy's sleeping body from the couch, light as a bundle of feathers, warm from the blanket she'd been wrapped in. The child smelled faintly of baby shampoo and the microwave dinner she'd eaten alone. Carol had carried her to the station wagon parked beneath the broken streetlight, making sure no one saw. And when the sun began to rise behind them, she drove. Amy had murmured once in her sleep, somewhere after dawn. A small, fragile sound, maybe a name, maybe a wish. Carol pulled into a lonely rest stop where only a parked semi sat, its driver asleep in the cab. She held her breath, waiting, listening. But the girl fell silent again, the way children do when exhaustion outweighs the world around them. Carol rested her forehead against the steering wheel for a moment, and then she started the engine. Because there was no turning back now, only forward into the heat, toward whatever future she could carve out for a little girl who deserved far better than the one she'd been given. She had moved with a strange, practiced calm in the back seat of the station wagon, her motions quick but gentle, the way a nurse might tend to a restless patient. The Valium tablets dissolved easily under the pressure of her spoon, turning the apple juice cloudy. She swirled the cup once, then tipped it toward the small, half-awake face beneath the blanket. "That's it, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Amy's forehead. "Just a sip. You're doing so well. Close your eyes now. When you wake up, the world will be kinder." Amy's lashes fluttered. The drug pulled her under in waves, her gaze drifting upward until her pupils vanished beneath heavy lids. For a split second, a cruel, uninvited flicker, Carol saw a different version of Rita Sandoval, 3 years earlier. Moving day. Rita trudging up the stairs, her daughter limp against her shoulder, face buried in her mother's neck. She looked tired, worn thin by life, but there had been something else in her expression, something soft, something dangerously close to love. Carol smothered the memory before it could bloom. That line of thinking was poison, a trap, a weakness meant to unravel everything. Rita didn't deserve that tenderness, didn't deserve forgiveness or understanding, not after what Carol had witnessed, documented, endured. The bindings had been logical, necessary. She had explained it all to Amy's drifting, half-conscious face as she secured the straps. Children flailed in their sleep. They unbuckled seatbelts. They opened doors without knowing why. This was protection. This was safety. And the washcloth tied around her little mouth. Pure precaution. Sometimes kids screamed from confusion, not danger, and Carol needed every ounce of focus to cross the state line unnoticed. The blanket was simply camouflage. If anyone glanced inside the car at a gas station, they'd see nothing but a sleeping child tucked in for a long ride. She had prepared for everything, every detail, every possible question. Amy's stuffed rabbit, the one missing an ear, rested beside her. The purple crayon, the worn coloring book with pages she'd watched the girl fill on the courtyard steps. A list of the foods she liked, the night fears she whispered about, the lullabies that calmed her. Carol knew this child, knew her in ways Rita never bothered to. Where Rita saw an interruption, a burden that ruined late nights and early mornings, Carol saw something entirely different. She saw a chance, a purpose, a future that could finally feel whole. "We're so close, baby," she murmured, her palm resting lightly on the blanket. "You're being incredibly brave. Your mama's proud of you." The word slipped out naturally, Mama. It fit. It felt like a name she had been waiting her entire life to claim. Not Carol from 7B. Not the woman who always ate dinner alone. A mother. Amy's mother. The role she'd practiced since the very first time. Those small eyes had risen to meet hers with trust instead of fear. A weather-beaten shell station rose from the scrubland ahead, lonely and sun-bleached. Just a sliver of gas left, enough to make it, but why gamble? Better to stop here, in a place where no one would remember her, and refill before pushing west. She eased the wagon beside the pump. Inside the station, a teenage boy leaned on the counter, flipping through a magazine. He looked up when she pulled in, eyes brushing over her car with indifferent curiosity before slipping back to the page. Perfect. Just another traveler. Exactly what she needed. When she shut off the engine, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural. No more rushing wind, no more tires humming against hot pavement, just a heavy, suffocating silence. She could hear her own breath, thin and uneven despite the calm she kept forcing into her hands. The metal beneath the hood clicked softly as it cooled. And from the back seat, nothing. A silence so complete it made her chest tight. She reached behind her, fingers brushing the worn edge of the brown blanket. Lifting it just an inch, She checked the rise and fall of the tiny body beneath. Amy's breathing was slow and thick with medication, her small nose damp with sweat from the trapped heat. The washcloth tied across her mouth had absorbed moisture but remained firmly in place. The strips of bedsheet around her wrists and ankles were still secure, knotted exactly as Carol had tied them. Perfect. Everything still in perfect order. She laid the blanket back gently, smoothing each corner, tucking it in as if she were putting a child to sleep in a warm nursery instead of the back seat of a baking station wagon. Then she stepped out into the harsh sunlight. The heat slammed into her like a wall. The air above the pavement quivered, twisting the horizon into a mirage. Far away, pale threads of heat lightning stitched the sky together without a sound. This stretch of the Panhandle had always felt like a place abandoned by mercy, a place that punished anyone who dared to cross it. Carol worked the pump like someone who'd done it 1,000 times. No glances toward the windows, no unnecessary movements, no invitation for attention. She finished quickly, slid the nozzle back into place, and walked inside to pay. The teenage attendant didn't even lift his head fully when she approached. "Pump 3, he muttered, 850. Carol counted out the exact amount, her fingers still as steady as they'd been that morning, not a tremor. "Heading far?" he asked, the words tossed out casually, nothing more than a bored boy trying to break his own monotony. "Albuquerque," she replied, keeping her tone light. "Family trip." The question dropped like ice into her stomach. She forced herself to meet his gaze. He was young, restless, sunburned, a kid who had spent too many summers in a place with nothing to do. "Just visiting relatives," she said, her voice smooth. "Long drive in this heat," he mumbled. "Your AC holding up?" "It's fine," she lied easily. "I keep the windows closed, less dust that way." He nodded, already drifting back to his magazine. "Safe travels." She accepted the receipt and stepped back into the blinding sun. Her car waited exactly where she'd left it, the blanket clearly visible through the rear window. Anyone walking by could have looked in. Anyone could have noticed the slight rise beneath the wool. But people rarely look. People rarely see. Most choose not to. In the station window's reflection, she caught sight of the back seat. For a heartbeat, she imagined she saw the faintest twitch near the lower edge of the blanket, a tiny bump, the kind a restless foot might make. But the heat twisted everything, bending light and shadow until nothing looked true. Probably just the shimmering air. That's all. She pushed the thought aside, climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared back to life. Carol pulled onto the highway again, letting the endless road swallow her whole. "Still with me, little one," she whispered toward the bundled shape behind her. That boy at the counter didn't notice a thing. Nobody ever does. We're ghosts on this road, and ghosts don't get caught. The highway devoured distance in long, colorless stretches. Dry shrubs clung to the earth like they were afraid of the wind. Thin fences ran for miles without guarding anything worth stealing. Every so often, a lonely ranch house sat hunched against the heat, looking abandoned even when it was. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. Nothing questioned her. The sameness gave her space to imagine what came next. She pictured the apartment waiting hundreds of miles ahead, a place she'd found through a tiny classified ad, the kind printed so faintly you had to squint to read it. 2 small bedrooms, a landlord who didn't pry, a lease paid with anonymous bills. She'd chosen a new name, One different enough to break old ties, but familiar enough that she'd answer when called. She signed Amy up for school under that same name. The forged documents she pieced together on her kitchen table looked convincing in a way that frightened even her. 3 weeks before classes began. 3 weeks to help Amy forget her old world. 3 weeks to become the mother she believed she was meant to be. "It'll be good, sweetheart," she said softly, eyes never leaving the road. "Your new clothes can be whatever color you want. Maybe that shade you always draw with, and your room will make it feel like it belongs only to you." She could see it so clearly it almost felt real. Mornings spent pouring cereal into bright bowls, evenings at the table sounding out spelling words, the soft weight of a child leaning into her side during a bedtime story, kisses on the forehead, nightlights, the quiet security of routine. All the tenderness she'd held inside for decades finally ready to overflow. All of it meant, in her mind, for the girl sleeping beneath that blanket. She was still deep inside that imagined life when something shifted in her mirror. A distant shape grew on the horizon, swelling as it approached. At first, she ignored it. Trucks ruled this road, and she had seen dozens already. But this one didn't surge past her like the others. It hung behind her, drawing closer and closer, until she could make out the square jaw of its chrome grille, the film of dust across its windshield, the heavy silhouette of the driver perched high in his seat. His shoulders looked enormous beneath his faded shirt, and the shadow of his cap hid everything but the impression of a hard stare. A pressure tightened in her chest. Instinct spoke before thought could catch up. A sharp, primal warning that stirred every fear she'd suppressed. She eased off the gas. He did the same. Perfectly. He stayed so close, she lost sight of his front bumper entirely. Then he hit his high beams. Brilliant white light exploded across her mirror, stabbing her eyes and jerking her heart into her throat. The station wagon wobbled toward the gravel before she jerked the wheel back, breath catching in her throat. Behind her, the truck kept its lights blazing even though the sun still burned high above them. Flash, flash, flash. "It's nothing." "Sweetheart," she murmured toward the blanket, though the strain in her voice betrayed her. "Just somebody being impatient. We're okay. We're okay." But she was. Her pulse hammered so hard she felt it in her fingers, in her jaw, in the base of her skull. Every story she'd ever heard about women chased on empty highways rose like ghosts around her. Stories of men who followed too long, men who wouldn't back off, men who made sure they were seen. Then the horn erupted, one long, punishing blast that vibrated through the old car, as if trying to shake the truth out of her. It felt like the sound said, "I know exactly who you are." Carol pushed the accelerator down. The wagon groaned in protest. 65, 17, still right behind her. Still locked to her bumper like a hunter, packing its prey. "He must have noticed something," she whispered. A cold certainty slid through her like ice water. He saw something he shouldn't have. Did the blanket shift? Did Amy mumble? Had a tiny hand reached toward the glass while she was inside pain. "Please stay asleep, baby," she breathed, panic tightening every word. Then the truck roared up beside her. She didn't dare look directly, but she didn't need to. He filled her side vision entirely. A towering figure gripping the wheel, waving an arm at her with frantic urgency. His mouth moved furiously, forming words she couldn't hear but felt pressed against her like a warning. He kept pointing, over and over, pointing toward the back seat. pointing at the shape beneath the blanket. Her foot hit the floor. 80, 85. The steering wheel trembled, fighting her grip. The engine shrieked like it was begging her to stop. The truck dropped back, then lunged forward again. The horn blared without pause now, an unbroken roar that drowned out the world. She flicked her eyes to the mirror. The blanket didn't move, not even a twitch. Yet the trucker was relentless, signaling like a man trying to save someone from a disaster only he could see. What had he noticed? What truth was he trying to shout through all that glass and noise? The road warped ahead of her as fear swallowed her focus. Her vision tunneled into a narrow, shaking frame. She was no longer thinking, just surviving, running, protecting what she insisted was hers. A quieter voice inside her tried to rise, the one that remembered Amy's real mother, the one that remembered how this all began, the one that whispered that none of this belonged to her. She shoved that voice into the deepest part of herself and locked the door on it. There was no room for doubt now, not when freedom felt so close she could taste it. The truck veered left as if preparing to cut her off. For a split second, she was certain he was about to force her off the pavement, tip them, crush them, end everything. But he held his lane, fell back, pushed forward, fell back again. He wasn't attacking. He was signaling, trying to tell her something in a language she refused to hear. Because hearing it meant seeing herself the way he saw her. It meant facing the truth she had been outrunning since dawn. It meant recognizing that the danger on this highway wasn't him. It was her. Up ahead through the shimmer of heat, a green sign appeared. State Police Station, next exit. The restraints, not deep but angry, irritated, too tight for too long. The trucker didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't swing at Carol. His entire body simply went still, like a man standing in front of a rattlesnake and praying it wouldn't strike. Then his breath left him in one hard exhale. "What did you do?" he whispered. Carol scrambled across the front seat, fingers fumbling for the lock, trying to pull the door shut again, trying to make time rewind just 30 seconds. But the trucker's hand came up, slow, deliberate, and pressed the door wide open. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Amy, on the trembling rise and fall of a small chest that had nearly stopped telling the world it existed. Inside the station, someone opened the door. Voices carried, lazy, joking, unaware. A moment later, one of the deputies spotted the scene. His brow furrowed, then his posture stiffened, then his hand dropped to the latch on his holster. The next seconds were a blur. The deputy jogged forward. Another followed. The trucker stepped back, palms up, surrendering to a situation he had no desire to own. Carol tried to shut the door again, but the deputy stopped her with a sharp command. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Carol shook her head violently. "She's mine." "Ma'am, step out." Amy made a small sound then, barely a whimper. The kind a child makes in a nightmare they can't wake from. It cut through everything. The heat, the tension, the years of whatever Carol had carried inside her. And in that moment, for the first time, Carol's face cracked. Not anger, not defiance. Something older, something hollowed out by years of choices she could never undo. "I was keeping her safe," she whispered. But no one believed that, maybe not even Carol. Two deputies moved in. One lifted Amy gently from the back seat, cradling her against his chest. The child sagged like a damp cloth, limp but alive. The other deputy pulled Carol out of the driver's seat, her voice spilling into the air. Nonsense, half-truths, fragments of a story that made sense only behind the locked doors of a mind that had drifted too far. Behind them, the trucker stood utterly still, eyes on the ground, hands shaking now that adrenaline no longer held them steady. The sky above the panhandle crackled with heat lightning again, silent, distant, a warning the earth had ignored. Inside the station, the cool air swallowed them all. The blanket slipped just enough for the truth to breathe. The little girl's legs were marked where the cloth ties had bitten into her skin, one ankle rubbed raw and beginning to bleed. Her pajamas, soft, bright, covered in tiny unicorns, looked impossibly innocent against the brutality of the scene. Amy's eyelids fluttered, trying to focus on the huge stranger looming above her, but her gaze slid away. Her head dangled to the side, heavy with sedation. A faint, broken sound escaped from behind the damp cloth over her mouth, something trapped between a sigh and a cry, the kind of sound that came from a child too drugged to understand she should be afraid. The trucker stared at her, as if reality had just shifted under his feet. First confusion, then the terrible click of understanding, and finally, the kind of horror that hollows a man out. He lifted his eyes toward the woman behind the glass. Carol. There was no way for her to hide from what he saw, not now. A worn-out woman in a wrinkled shirt, hair clinging to her temples, sunglasses sliding down her face. A woman sitting behind the wheel of a running car, while a bound and gagged child lay helpless in the back seat. A woman who had driven faster when he followed her. A woman who had chosen flight over explanation. Because the truth she carried was heavier than any lie she could invent. The trucker muttered something, his voice cracked in the middle, and reached into the back seat with trembling hands. He checked the girl's breathing, her pulse, the sluggish rise of her chest, and as he realized the full weight of what he was seeing, he staggered backward, eyes fixed on Carol as though afraid she might dissolve into the heat haze and vanish. Then he ran, straight toward the glass doors of the police station. Carol didn't move. Her hands rested on the steering wheel like they'd been carved there. The engine hummed. The key waited. She could slam the car into reverse, shoot out of the parking lot, hit the highway again. The state line was practically brushing her fingertips. But she knew. The moment the trucker crossed that threshold, the story she had spent years building, layer by layer, lie by lie, was dust. The station door swung open. Two officers strode out, their expressions sharpened by long experience. The trucker followed them, pointing, describing, replaying everything he had just seen. Their steps grew more focused as they spotted the old wagon. Carol felt their gaze settle on her with the weight of a verdict already passed. Her fingers slipped from the wheel and dropped into her lap. Behind her in the mirror's narrow frame, Amy lay slumped but breathing, foggy, fragile, powerless. Tiny unicorns gleamed on her pajamas, the same pajamas Carol had picked out, folded neatly, packed carefully, as if clothing could make someone yours. But the girl in the mirror had never been hers. And now there was no world left in which she could pretend otherwise. The older officer, lines etched deep into his face, hair silvered by years of carrying other people's nightmares, stepped forward, hands steady, jaw tight, eyes locked on Carol like he'd seen this ending long before she had. The senior officer stepped up to Carol's window and rapped once firm, controlled, final. He tried the handle, locked. Then he motioned downward. Carol's fingers trembled only once before she forced them toward the crank. The glass squealed as it inched open, letting in a blast of scorching air, and the heavy, sour smell rising from the back seat. A smell that could no longer be denied or explained away. The officer leaned down. His eyes were warm brown, worn by years of seeing far too much. His voice carried no anger, only a kind of tired grief. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle." Carol answered with the steadiness of someone convinced righteousness was on her side. "I can explain. I have everything documented. 3 years' worth. Her mother leaves her alone for hours. Different men coming and going, the arguments, the screaming. I've written all of it down. I can show you." Her words tumbled out faster, fueled by certainty rather than panic. "I know her routines, her allergies. She can't eat strawberries, they make her break out. She has nightmares, so I keep a light on. Her favorite color is purple." She gestured toward the pajamas, barely visible behind the officer's shoulder. "See, I know her. I know what she needs. I give her what she needs. I'm her mother now." The officer's expression didn't harden. It softened, almost painfully. "Ma'am, that's a restrained child in your back seat. It's for her safety during the drive. I told her that. She understood." Carol's voice was unwavering, frightening in its calm. "She needs me. You don't understand. Her real mother doesn't love her. Not the way I do. I rescued her. I did what no one else would." Behind him, the younger officer had opened the back door. He knelt beside the girl, radio already pressed to his mouth, his words clipped and urgent. Requests for paramedics, backup, procedures that would roll over Carol's world like an avalanche she could no longer outrun. "Ma'am," the older officer said again, firmer this time, "I need you to step out of the vehicle, right now." Carol looked at him, really looked. And in that moment, she realized the gulf between her story and theirs was too wide to cross. She had cast herself as the savior of a neglected child. But the men standing in front of her didn't see love, or devotion, or sacrifice. They saw a child tied up in the back of a car. They saw drugs, restraints, bruises. They saw a kidnapper. Nothing she said would ever reshape that picture. "Her name is Amy," Carol whispered. "She's 7, she's sweet. She deserved more than what she was given. I could have given her more." She paused, her voice cracking for the first time. "I can step out of the vehicle." Her hands felt foreign, detached from the body that had spent months planning this moment. They drifted toward the door handle. The latch clicked. The officer took a cautious step back, palm resting on the grip of his gun. Carol stepped into the blinding heat. The world shrank to concrete, sunlight, and judgment. Behind the officers, the younger cop gently lifted Amy from the car. The child sagged against him, her head nestled against his chest, eyes closed, limp, exhausted. He cradled her the way Carol had so many times, the way Carol believed only she could. But when he did it, no one questioned him. No one doubted the purity of it. People would call him a hero. And watching him carry Amy away, safe, protected, comforted, something inside Carol finally cracked under the weight of the truth she had tried so desperately to rewrite. The moment the metal closed around Carol's wrists, everything she'd been clinging to shattered. The cuffs were colder than she imagined, unyielding, heavy, nothing like the warm, feather-light weight of the little girl she had lifted off a couch only hours earlier. The officer's voice drifted around her, repeating words she knew she was supposed to hear, but none of it landed. None of it mattered. Her eyes were locked on the station doors. She watched them swing shut behind the officer carrying Amy inside. And with that closing door, the truth finally broke through the story she'd been telling herself. Not her child, not her daughter, just a 7-year-old girl she had taken because she had mistaken longing for love, obsession for purpose, and years of watching from a distance as proof she knew best. The realization hit like a sickness rising from deep inside, a dizzying, sickening collapse of everything she built in her mind. Across the lot, the trucker who'd stopped her stood near his massive rig, staring. His expression wasn't simple anger. It was a tangled mix of shock and sorrow, of someone who had glimpsed a truth too awful to ignore. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, and Carol opened her mouth to speak. But she stopped, because in that gaze, steady, devastated, she finally saw what the world saw. A woman who had given a child sedatives, who had tied her small limbs with homemade restraints, who had driven her through blistering summer heat, while whispering love to a blanket hiding a terrified, half-conscious girl. She had become the very danger she believed she was rescuing Amy from. The officer at her side touched her elbow, guiding her toward the patrol car. He wasn't unkind, but there was no room for debate, no space left for her delusions to breathe. She didn't fight. She didn't plead. She simply walked. The future she'd crafted, an imaginary home in New Mexico, soft mornings, a child calling her mama with trust instead of fear, dissolved the moment that back door swung open and sunlight spilled onto the truth. Now there was only asphalt, restraints, and a silence heavy with consequences. When they sat her in the back of the cruiser, the hard, molded seat pressed into her spine. It was built for people the world needed to protect others from, people like her. Through the window, she could still see the trucker. He was speaking to the older officer, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. His shoulders shook once. He wasn't crying for Carol. He was grieving for the child he'd pulled out of the darkness, for the nightmare he had stumbled into, for what could have happened if he hadn't followed his instincts. The engine rumbled to life. As the patrol car rolled forward, past the trucker's towering rig, past the station wagon that would soon be photographed, searched, dissected, Carol felt the last remains of her imagined world crumble behind her. She twisted enough to look over her shoulder at the small brick building growing smaller in the distance. Somewhere inside those walls, Amy was breathing clean air again. She was safe. She was being held by people who truly understood what protection meant. And for the first time, Carol faced the reality she had spent 3 years running from. She hadn't saved Amy. Amy had been saved from her. Carol watched the police station shrink until it became nothing more than a pale shape against the horizon. Somewhere inside that building, the little girl she'd carried away was waking, surrounded by strangers who moved gently, spoke softly, asked her questions she might not remember how to answer. And soon, someone would place a call to the only person who had the right to claim her. Her mother, the woman Carol had judged, condemned, and replaced in her mind. A woman who, despite her flaws, had never poisoned her child, never tied her hands, never rewritten reality to justify a crime. The patrol car rolled onto the open highway, taking them east, toward the town she'd left behind, toward the apartment complex where Rita still slept, unaware that Dawn had almost stolen her daughter from her, unaware someone had decided her motherhood wasn't enough. Carol let her eyes fall shut. Behind her eyelids, Amy's face floated up, heavy-lidded, skin marked from the restraints, the confusion of drugs softening her features. A face Carol had convinced herself she was rescuing, a face she had almost erased forever. Both truths existed side by side, refusing to cancel each other out. She had wanted to save her. She had nearly destroyed her. Her mind drifted to the notebook waiting back in her apartment, the one filled with 3 years of detailed surveillance, meals tracked, schedules copied, arguments overheard and written down, every page a brick in the twisted foundation she built, step by step, until she believed she had earned the right to take someone else's child. 3 years of planning, 3 years of feeding a fantasy, until it felt like destiny. And in the end, it had all fallen apart because a truck driver happened to be looking in exactly the right direction at exactly the right second, just as a small, drugged hand slipped against the glass. Fate, luck, or something greater had intervened. Another warning she could no longer outrun. The cruiser merged onto the long stretch of Interstate 40, the same road she'd sped down earlier with certainty burning in her chest. Now the same landscape unfolded in reverse. Dusty plains, lonely fences, sun sinking slowly toward the west, as if marking the end of a chapter she never meant to write. Carol opened her eyes and watched Texas glide past through the reinforced window. This was her world now. A world of locked doors, scheduled meals, and years counted not by holidays but by parole hearings. A life defined by the single, terrible choice she had made in the name of love, or what she had convinced herself love was. The officer driving glanced at her through the mirror. His eyes carried no anger, only a tired understanding. The kind a person develops after witnessing too many broken stories. "She's going to be all right," he said quietly. "The little girl, she's going to make it." Carol swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." Carol didn't speak. She couldn't. Words failed her because there were no answers that could fit the weight of what had happened. She didn't know what hours trapped in the back of a car would leave on a child's heart. She didn't know how the edges of fear might linger, how quiet terror might settle into the corners of a 7-year-old's mind, or whether the trust she had shattered could ever be rebuilt. Would Amy remember her at all, or would time and mercy erase her from memory entirely, leaving only a shadow of unease whenever a station wagon rolled past? The thought made her chest tight. The sun was sinking low, bleeding gold and red across the asphalt. The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of uncertainty cutting through the desert. The cruiser carried her east, away from every plan she had ever drafted, every imagined future she had carefully stacked, every moment she had convinced herself was rescued. Now all of it felt fragile, evaporating under the weight of reality. She was heading toward what came next, toward the remainder of her life measured in consequence, in the long shadow cast by a single, irrevocable day, toward the bitter truth that some mistakes follow you forever, that some questions, why, how could you, have no answers worth hearing. Some stories do not end with justice or redemption, only with the cold acknowledgement of actions that cannot be undone. The landscape darkened. Stars blinked into existence, tiny witnesses to a vast, indifferent sky. Carol, who had risen that morning filled with certainty, certainty in her love, in her purpose, in the righteousness of her choice, now rode in silence. The only truth that remained was unflinching, undeniable. She had been wrong about everything. Story 2, Shadows of a Forgotten Vow. The farmhouse rose from the fields exactly where Oscar had said it would. 3 miles past the abandoned grain elevator, down a lane that felt more like a memory than a road on any modern map. Lena pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the passenger window as their sedan creaked and groaned over ruts that had not been touched in decades. Corn stretched endlessly on either side, stalks brittle and brown, swaying in rhythms that seemed to exist for themselves rather than any passing breeze. Oscar's hands gripped the steering wheel with a rigidity that made the knuckles stark, rigid, like fence posts carved from human skin. He didn't speak as the house slowly revealed itself through the thinning corn, as though the crop hesitated to let it be seen. 2 stories of weathered wood, paint flacking like dried skin. A porch drooped as if it had been exhaling for years, and the windows were mirrors of gray, reflecting nothing but the heavy sky. Lena watched Oscar's profile, tracing the line of his jaw, the subtle tension around his eyes, the tiny, unconscious shifts she had come to know over 14 months of marriage. But this, what she saw now, was older than their vows. It was a face and a body carved by echoes of someone else's claims, someone else's history, a past that still held sway beneath his skin. The tension in his muscles answered to doors long closed, to promises made and broken long before she had entered his life. The sedan rolled forward, crunching the dry earth, as Lena realized that the story she thought she was part of had roots tangled deep in soil she had never sown. And somewhere in that house, shadows waited, shadows that remembered, that refused to forget, and that might still think they held a claim to what Oscar now called his own. Lena had studied the old photographs countless times, faded snapshots of a boy in a world that seemed impossibly remote. The farmhouse in each picture looked smaller, less certain, yet now, in person, it loomed with an unexpected gravity, as if it had grown into its own stubborn reality. Oscar's mother had walked away in the early 70s, leaving only warnings and bitter anecdotes that he had once shrugged off as the echoes of old trauma. But as he guided their car onto the gravel drive, cutting the engine with meticulous care, Lena began to sense the truth. This place had a hold, a quiet insistence that lingered whether you fled or stayed. The corn around them made a sound that could only be called whispering, a hush that threaded through the brittle stalks, secrets passing in a language just out of reach. That first afternoon dissolved into dim light as they carried boxes from the car, their steps stirring decades of dust. Inside, the house smelled of old wallpaper paste, mouse droppings, and a faint, underlying earthiness that belonged to forgotten corners. But Oscar moved like he belonged, tracing an invisible map etched into the floorboards, nodding which doors stuck and which beams caught the sun at certain hours. Lena watched him from the kitchen window, the horizon bled with twilight, the cornfield stretching beyond the house, a brittle brown expanse. The stalks should have been harvested weeks ago, she thought, reading her mental notes from farming guides she had studied in preparation. When she mentioned it, Oscar only ran his hands under the faucet, testing the flow, drying them on his jeans without sparing her a glance, as if her observation was irrelevant. That night, lying in the bedroom that had once been Oscar's, Lena listened to the house breathe. Old homes creak inside, she knew that much, but this was different. The sounds felt intentional, a subtle negotiation with the new occupants, like a body adjusting itself around a stranger's presence. Oscar slept beside her, deep and steady, and she envied the peace in his chest, the rhythm of untroubled rest. Outside, darkness had mass, pressing against the windows with the solidity of a living thing. No stars. No moon. Just the field, endless and suffocating in its blackness. Morning revealed the secrets the night had concealed. Oscar was already awake, moving through the kitchen with the fluid familiarity of someone inhabiting a house built from memory. Lena stepped carefully after him, watching how he navigated around worn thresholds and familiar corners. Every gesture was precise, as if the walls themselves guided him. The farmhouse seemed to recognize him, accommodating, bending slightly to acknowledge his return. And Lena understood, finally, why his mother had left yet always feared the place. It claimed a part of you, and that claim did not forget. Lena stepped into the kitchen, the wooden floorboards groaning under her weight, and through the window she spotted him standing motionless at the edge of the field. His face lifted, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the sky, listening to a sound she couldn't hear. The corn, once only brown and brittle, now seemed alive in daylight, forming narrow corridors that drew the eye toward some hidden center, a destination she couldn't yet grasp. She set the old percolator on the stove, the glass knob smeared with years of grease, and waited for the water to bubble. While it heated, she took in the kitchen's muted history, yellowed curtains fraying at the edges, a calendar frozen on July 1973, a ceramic rooster on the sill staring out at the field with a rigid, unblinking vigilance, or maybe terror. Oscar entered just as the coffee finished its slow hiss, carrying with him the scent of the land, earthy, decayed, alive and dying all at once. He accepted the mug without a word, cradling it in his hands, already lost to some distant task. The day was consumed by the barn, its roof, perforated with rust and holes, let in shafts of dusty light that illuminated piles of straw and burlap. Oscar moved among them with effortless precision, tending to the scarecrows first. Every motion suggested a memory etched deep into muscle. Skills rehearsed countless times without conscious thought. When Lena dared to approach, she noticed the shapes emerging on his workbench. These weren't generic forms, lifeless effigies. They had faces, small tilts of the head, proportions that suggested personality, individuality. The scarecrows seemed almost human, uncanny in their specificity. He worked as though guided by some unseen hand, hands remembering secrets the mind could not name. She let him be and wandered the edges of their property, partly to map the land, partly to escape the intensity of his focus. The corn dominated everything, dense and unyielding, 40 acres or more, swallowing the house entirely when she stepped too far in. Among the stalks, she spotted the remains of previous scarecrows, rotted poles, tattered clothing, faded hints of faces long since vanished into decay. The field whispered of time, of labor, and of devotion twisted by memory, and Lena felt the weight of it all pressing down, even in the thin autumn air. Lena squinted across the edge of the field, her heart tightening as her eyes settled on a lone figure slumped against a rotting fence post. At first, she thought it was another scarecrow, but as she drew nearer, the details became disturbingly specific. The denim overalls, faded, striped just so, were unmistakable. She'd seen that same pattern countless times in town, worn by the man behind the counter at the grocery store. What was his name? Something like Kruger. Her pulse quickened as she examined the scarecrow more closely. The face had caved inward over time, but the form beneath carried a weight and bulk that mirrored the store clerk's frame. Even the gloved hands looked too large, too strong, like they had once held something real. A creak from the barn snapped her gaze away. Oscar emerged carrying another figure, cradling it with a careful tenderness that sent an unsettling shiver down her spine. From this distance, she could see how meticulously he had shaped the burlap, the subtle brush strokes suggesting eyes, a mouth, the illusion of life. By the time Lena reached the porch, Oscar had planted it on a tall pole at the northeastern edge of the cornfield. The scarecrow faced inward, arms outstretched, and Lena froze. The features, the curve of the jaw, the tilt of the brow, awoke something in her memory, a vague familiarity that refused to resolve into certainty. It was a face she might have known, or imagined knowing, a ghostly echo of someone ordinary, someone who spoke in small talk and sorted forms at a desk. Oscar turned back toward the barn, his steps deliberate, eyes fixed, as if the day's rhythm demanded no deviation. Lena realized then that this was only the beginning. More would come. He needed the perimeter complete. Days settled into a rigid cadence. Oscar rose with the sun and disappeared into the barn, emerging only briefly to eat with mechanical efficiency. When he did, the scarecrows had multiplied, each anchored like sentinels around the corn's edge. And Lena's unease grew because each one carried unsettling familiarity. The gas station clerk, the librarian, even the pastor from the church visible from their upstairs window. She tried to probe, first cautiously, then with increasing insistence, asking about the likenesses. Oscar would answer, technically accurate yet opaque, as though his words were shields. Scarecrows look like people, he would say, and when pressed about the meticulous details, he spoke of memory, of authenticity, as if remembrance alone could explain the eerie precision. And Lena felt it, the creeping certainty that she was living among echoes of the town itself. Every burlap face a reflection of someone she knew, or thought she knew. Every stalk of corn, a silent witness to a world growing stranger by the day. Lena couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, something vital that the farm should have been alive with. Birds, there were none. By the second morning, she noticed the emptiness, a hollow sky stretching overhead like a gray lid pressing down. No crows croaked from the treetops. No hawks carved circles above the fields. Even the usual flocks of starlings were absent. The silence made the corn feel denser, more secretive, as though the very air conspired to close her in. Then came the straw. First, a single hollow stalk floating in her morning coffee like a drowned thing. Later, a small brittle pile in the bathroom sink. By night, Lena would find it pressed into the bed sheets, tucked into her hair, slipping beneath the nightgown she thought she'd left untouched. Her own body began to feel unreal, disconnected from its basic functions. She hadn't gone through ordinary routines in days, not for hunger, not for thirst, not even for sleep. Tasks were performed out of habit, out of expectation. Like an actor reciting lines in a play she no longer believed in. She mentioned it to Oscar. He barely lifted his gaze, his hands stained from whatever work consumed him in the barn. "You're tracking it in from outside," he said casually. "Old houses have old dust." His indifference was so absolute, so unwavering, that for a moment Lena doubted her own perception. And then it hit her, the dry, persistent tickle in her throat, the coughs that left nothing but a raw rasp. This morning she realized with a jolt it hadn't been dust. The fibers she tasted, felt scrape her throat, had been straw. Hollow, stiff yet bendable, unmistakably strong. By afternoon she drove into town, seeking the rational anchors of the world she'd left behind. The bank manager was blunt. The farm's debts were monumental, taxes unpaid for years, foreclosure looming unless productivity could be proven by spring. Oscar's insistence on returning had been framed as duty, the preservation of 4 generations' labor. He had come to save a legacy, but Lena now wondered what she had saved herself from. Watching the field from the edge of town, the scarecrows multiplied in her mind, each one painstakingly formed, each one hauntingly familiar, and Oscar moving among them with a purpose that bypassed her entirely. For the first time, fear curled through her chest with icy fingers. Something about this place was not merely old or abandoned. It was deliberate, alive in ways she couldn't name. And she was in it, at its mercy, with no clear way out. The town library was a squat brick building, tucked into the corner of a street that barely saw traffic. Inside, the air smelled of aging paper and the slow decay of forgotten bindings. Lena stepped through the doorway, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, and immediately felt the weight of time pressing down. Behind the desk, a frail woman looked up. Her hands were knotted, joints swollen, fingers moving with a deliberate stiffness that made every gesture seem choreographed. There was a flicker in her gaze as Lena introduced herself and asked about the Brenner farm, a hesitation, a microsecond where curiosity wrestled with caution. Lena noticed it, a subtle beat that revealed the woman's internal struggle. Which face should she wear? Her voice followed, even and precise, each word delivered with a measured cadence that left no room for inflection. She rose to her feet in a single, fluid motion, joints cracking with mechanical clarity. It was unnerving, her movement almost too deliberate, too clean, as though she were a figure stepping out of an old film reel. The nameplate at her desk read Novik. Novik claimed to know the Brenner family and led Lena to the records that remained. 3 delicate folders labeled local history and agriculture, alongside a box of photographs preserved by the Historical Society. Lena spread the documents across the reading table, the afternoon light spilling through dusty, grimy windows that hadn't seen cleaning in decades. The images told a story of rise and decay. In the 1950s, the farm looked alive, rows of green corn stretching tall, the farmhouse freshly painted, the family posing proudly in the yard. But by 1968, the rhythm had changed. The corn had grown wild, encroaching on paths and pressing against the house itself. A newspaper clipping from 1969 described a fire that damaged an outbuilding, contained but significant. By 1971, another report documented a dispute over maintenance, forcing county intervention. The final photograph from 1972 showed the farmhouse nearly swallowed by tall, unkempt stalks. On the back, in faded handwriting, "Let it go. Some land should be worked." Throughout Lena's examination, Novik remained eerily still, not hovering, but somehow entirely present in the room without a single unnecessary movement. Lena couldn't tell if she had blinked, shifted her weight, or breath. When asked about the family, Novik explained her connection. Her husband had attended school with the eldest Brenner son, Oscar's father. He had spoken of the farm with intensity, describing it as if it were alive, as though it demanded care beyond reason. According to Novik, the family had left in the early 70s after unspecified trouble, moving to Minneapolis or perhaps beyond. Their absence had not surprised anyone. The land was abandoned, left to the wild corn, and the whispers of history seemed to settle over it, waiting for someone who understood its hold to return. By now, the scarecrows had multiplied to 13, forming an unbroken ring around the cornfield. Each stood with deliberate precision, facing inward, guardians over the brittle stalks that refused to yield, even under wind that should have flattened them. At night, Lena pressed her face to the bedroom window, and the figures appeared as dark, silent silhouettes, watching, waiting, a boundary between what could be known and what the corn concealed. There was something unnerving about them. Each suggested a human presence without fully revealing it, a face that triggered recognition but never memory. A librarian, or perhaps the essence of a librarian, a gas station attendant, or the idealized memory of one, a pastor from a church that may have existed only in imagination. Lena could no longer trust her own recollections. Had she really driven into town, exchanged words with these people, or had the corn planted the suggestion of their existence, coaxing her to believe she'd left the farm when she had? The scarecrows seemed to animate for a heartbeat when she passed, then froze, returning to their silent watch. Oscar had begun to vanish at night. She would wake at 3 or 4 in the morning, and his side of the bed would be empty. Through the glass, she would see him among the scarecrows, adjusting an arm here, a tilt of the head there. Once, she stood frozen for nearly an hour, watching him before one figure. The one she suspected represented a pastor. He remained motionless, head tilted back, as if engaged in a conversation beyond her senses. The straw problem worsened. It was no longer a trickle in isolated corners. It now marked paths through the house, from the barn to the field, threading through rooms like deliberate breadcrumbs. Lena swept, vacuumed, wiped, yet the lines reappeared, stubbornly precise, sometimes within minutes of her efforts. Her coughing had escalated. Spasms racked her chest, bending her over the sink, eyes watering, throat raw. What emerged from her was unmistakable, fibrous, hollow, straw, impossible yet undeniable. She tried to confront Oscar to make him see the absurdity of it. He looked at her with eyes tinged yellow, the whites faintly jaundiced, and spoke in a voice she could only describe as papery, brittle. "You're just adjusting to the country air. Your body isn't used to the chaff, to grain dust." But Lena knew it wasn't dust. It was something else, something deliberate, something that the corn and whatever it watched over was feeding into the very air she breathed. Lena's voice cracked as she tried again, desperate. "Oscar, this isn't dust. These are full blades of straw." But he didn't even flinch. He didn't turn. He didn't see her. Instead, he kept stitching, his fingers moving with a cold, mechanical calm. "Everything feels worse when you're not used to it," he murmured, as if reciting a line he'd practiced. "You're letting this place get in your head, that's all." She stepped closer. "Look at me. Really look at me and tell me you don't notice anything wrong." At last he faced her, but the expression he wore wasn't anger, it was pity. Detached, patient, patronizing. "You're spiraling over nothing," he said softly. "The farm affects everyone. My mother thought the corn was watching her too. She lost herself to that fear. You're doing the same thing." His tone was so smooth, so confident, that for a split second Lena felt her thoughts tilt. Was she imagining the patterns? Was the isolation twisting her perception? Could stress alone make everything feel alive? But the coughing burned through that doubt. She leaned over the workbench, hacking until her throat screamed and spat into her hand. There, lying across her palm, was a long, solid blade of straw, red at one end where it had scraped her raw. She held it up between them. "Explain this." Oscar barely glanced at it. "You swallowed something, or breathed in debris from the barn. There's dust everywhere." "Stop," she whispered. "Just stop." She squeezed the straw in her fist. It bent but didn't break, stiff and unnatural. "What's happening to us, Oscar? And what are you really doing with those scarecrows?" For the first time in days, he met her gaze without slipping away, and what she saw hollowed her stomach. The man she loved wasn't there. His face looked, tightened, pulled inward as if the bone beneath had shrunk while the skin tried to cling to it. His eyes had dulled to a murky yellow, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried a dry, rustling hiss, like wind moving through dead stalks. "I'm guarding what belongs here," he said. "It's my duty. It's what we were always meant for." Lena staggered back, keeping her eyes locked on him the way someone watches a wild animal, careful, slow, calculating. "We're leaving today, right now." He followed her with unnatural precision, each step too deliberate. His knee bent with a brittle crumple, like something hollow bending under pressure. "The farm needs us," he whispered. "No," she said, voice shaking. "It's dying. It's debt and decay and nothing more." "You're wrong." His mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. This land is older than any of that, older than the crops, older than my family. It waited, and now the cycle continues. You're talking like none of this is human. I'm talking perfectly clearly, he replied. You're just not ready to understand it yet. He took another step toward her, slow, intentional, the sound of rustling husks following his joints. And Lena realized something terrible. Whatever was standing in front of her, whatever was wearing her husband's skin, it was Oscar anymore. You will be, the voice seemed to hiss from the edges of the fields. The straw will guide you. The straw knows the way. Panic ignited, sharp and white-hot. Lena tore down the porch steps, heart hammering in her ears. Her hands fumbled at the car keys, shaking so violently that she dropped them twice before finally managing to start the engine. The motor roared to life, blessed, mercifully real, and she slammed it into reverse, gravel spraying behind her like sparks from a dying fire. In the rearview mirror, Oscar stood unmoving on the porch, patient, intense, the same rigid, silent vigilance that the scarecrows carried across the cornfield. For a moment, Lena felt the walls of the road close in, the stalks leaning toward the car, bending the world into an impossible tunnel. She pressed harder on the accelerator, convinced she might never escape that corridor of brittle brown. Then slowly the corn receded. The horizon opened. The asphalt of the state highway spread before her, painted lines slicing the chaos of the farmland into neat order. She drove on, mile after mile, until her hands stilled, until the pounding in her chest eased, until she could finally stop at a gas station and force herself to inhale normally again. The attendant who approached didn't quite move like a human. He stood perfectly still, as if his body had forgotten how to exist in time and his eyes didn't track her motion. They hovered slightly to her left, focusing on something she had left behind. When Lena tried to speak, a violent cough overtook her. Her hand flew to her mouth, and when she pulled it away, she held a tiny bundle of wet straw, knotted impossibly, the fibers tangled as if deliberately woven by some meticulous hand. The man recoiled in visible disgust. Lena didn't wait to understand it. She slipped back into the car and drove straight to the nearest hospital, 40 miles away, where a doctor with gentle gray-streaked hair met her with quiet professionalism. She told him everything: the straw, the scarecrows that mirrored neighbors, the man who was once her husband and now something other, something hollow and rustling with intent. Hearing herself speak made her stomach twist. The story sounded insane, the kind of paranoid delusion a stressed, isolated woman might spin from ordinary rural life. And yet, she knew the truth in her bones. The farm had always been wrong, older than her husband, older than the Brenner name, and now it had begun to consume everything she loved. The doctor listened, nodding, taking notes with steady hands, the professional calm a stark contrast to the madness of her recollection. But Lena didn't care about disbelief or doubt. She only knew one thing with clarity as she recounted each horrifying moment. She had escaped the field, but not the shadow of the farm, not the memory of what had taken root there, and not the certainty that some cycle had been set in motion, waiting for the next hand to tend it. Balance settled in her palm, the cold metal anchoring her trembling. Every instinct screamed at her to strike, to end this ritual before it could reach its conclusion. Yet as she stepped forward, the shadows of the barn seemed to stretch and twist around her, elongating Oscar's figure, turning him into something unrecognizable, something beyond the man she had married. The scarecrow on the bench seemed to watch her, its burlap face beginning to take shape, uncanny in its familiarity. Lena's own features had been stitched into it with deliberate care, the tilt of her brow, the line of her jaw, the shadow of her eyes. It was not a reflection. It was a claim, an assertion that the farm and whatever force lived in it was attempting to fold her into its cycle. "You understand now," Oscar murmured, the rasp of his voice scraping through the barn like dry leaves in wind. "You see what it wants. You belong here." "No," Lena spat, the word shaking her teeth. "I'm not yours. This ends now." The sickle swung in her grip, an extension of the determination and fear coiled inside her. The air in the barn seemed to thicken, the faint scent of rot and straw pressing against her lungs, each inhale a reminder of the unnatural life pulsing in the corn beyond. Oscar didn't flinch, didn't turn. His body remained taut, a puppet of obsession, of something older than him, older than the land. "You can fight it," he whispered, almost regretfully, "but the farm remembers. The farm waits, and it always completes the circle." Lena's gaze shifted to the scarecrow again, to the cruel familiarity of her own face staring back. The barn felt impossibly large, the shadows alive, the silence vibrating with anticipation. Every instinct screamed that she could not allow this to continue, that she must sever whatever link had been formed, whatever claim the farm thought it held. With a deep breath, she lunged, every motion precise and deliberate, the sickle an extension of her will to survive, to reclaim herself. The barn echoed with the scrape of metal against wood, the rustle of burlap, and in that chaos the spell of the farm wavered. Lena felt the first true sense of control in days, the realization that she was still her own person, still able to act, to resist, to escape. Outside, the wind stirred the corn, a low murmur passing through the field like a warning. But Lena didn't hesitate. She stepped back toward the door, ready to run, ready to leave the farm and its shadows behind. For the first time, she understood. The land might wait, the scarecrows might watch, and Oscar might have been lost long ago. But she would not be taken. She would not be claimed. The sickle hung at her side as she crossed the threshold into night, the farmhouse and barn shrinking behind her in the darkness. Every step was a defiance, a reclaiming of breath, of body, of mind. And as the corn whispered behind her, Lena ran toward the highway, toward light, toward a life that was still hers to take. Lena's voice trembled, a whisper meant to anchor what little reality remained. "Look at me," she commanded. Slowly, Oscar turned. But the man she had known, the one she had loved, was gone. In his place was something unrecognizable, his face flattened, eyes sunken into black hollows, mouth nothing more than a taut stitched line. Words left his lips, but they carried no warmth, no recognition, only the dry hiss of something inhuman. "You're not him," Lena breathed, the truth spilling out before she could stop herself. "You were never him. I am more him than he ever was. I am what the farm always demanded, fully claimed, fully part of the cycle." Driven by a surge of fear, disgust, and something primal that rejected this impossibility, Lena swung the sickle. The motion was seamless, instinctive, the culmination of every moment that had brought her to this barn, to this confrontation. The blade struck Oscar's midsection with precision, slicing across as if it should have ended a life. But what erupted from the wound was not flesh, not blood, not anything that should have been alive. It was straw, golden, dry, cascading like harvest grain. Layer upon layer poured out, so densely packed that when Oscar stumbled backward, his body fell with a hollow thud, echoing like a bale of hay collapsing in the field. He gazed down at the torrent of straw spilling from him, then lifted his head to meet Lena's eyes. There was something in that expression, a strange mixture of disappointment, resignation, and almost relief. "Now you see," he rasped, a sound like dry leaves scraping against one another. "Now you finally see what we are." Lena's mind splintered in that instant. fracturing under the weight of evidence that obliterated every assumption she had ever held. Her body stumbled, the sickle slipping from her grasp as instinct propelled her toward the house, not to escape, but to confirm the horror she already knew. The bathroom mirror greeted her like a cruel oracle, silvered and flawless. She gazed at her reflection, memorizing the familiar details of 28 years of life, the slight unevenness of her eyes, the freckle beneath her left ear, the stubborn cowlick that defied every comb. Then, trembling, she lifted her hands and began to peel. Skin yielded effortlessly, bloodless, revealing not bone and muscle, but tightly woven burlap beneath. She clawed at her cheeks, her forehead, her chin. With every strip torn away, the person in the mirror became less human, less living, transforming into a construct, a vessel stuffed with consciousness that had never been alive. Her scream, raw and instinctual, emerged not as sound but as a rustling like wind sweeping through desiccated corn. Understanding unfolded in layers, slow and jagged, each revelation stacked upon the last, a terrifying architecture of truth forming from the chaos. The farm was older than flesh, older than blood, older than life itself. The people, the scarecrows, her husband, even herself, merely threads woven into a cycle that had existed long before her birth, a cycle that now demanded completion. And in that fractured comprehension, Lena saw it all, saw the horrifying elegance of a world where life and imitation, memory and construct were indistinguishable, bound by the relentless, whispering will of the land. She lingered in the kitchen as the first pale light of morning filtered through the grimy windows, casting long gray shadows across the worn linoleum. She stood where a woman named Lena should have stood, moving through motion she had once thought familiar, pouring water into a percolator, adjusting the flame beneath it, inhaling the faint scent of oil and age. And yet the truth struck her like ice. There had never been a woman named Lena. There had never been a man named Oscar. There had only ever been the corn, immense, patient, and quietly relentless, and the farm it had claimed decades ago, swallowing the lives of those who had dared to call it home. The memories she had carried, believed to be hers, were not hers at all. They belonged to the family who had lived here before the world had ended for them. Real people with real flesh, real love, real fear. The kind of intricate existence no animated scarecrow, no matter how meticulously constructed, could ever hope to reproduce. The corn had absorbed these lives through roots that penetrated deeper than soil, deeper than bedrock, into some hidden stratum of existence where consciousness lingered even after death. And then, in the loneliness of that enduring memory, the corn had tried to return them. The scarecrows lining the edges of the fields had been its first attempts, fragile hollowed shapes of straw and burlap, bearing ghostly fragments of lives it had stolen and stored. The corn had taught them to walk, to gesture, to mimic thought and intention, but they had always lacked something essential, the spark that made them truly alive. They had been experiments in resurrection, imperfect echoes of reality, inert and incomplete. Time, patience, and relentless obsession had changed that. The corn had learned to lie, to convince itself that these straw figures were real, that their memories were authentic, that they could believe in a life they had never lived. It had forged entire narratives, weaving false experiences so convincing that its primary creations, Lena and Oscar, were fooled entirely. They remembered love, marriage, ordinary human anxieties and joys, all of it scripted, all of it forced into their minds by the subtle, unyielding will of the corn. It did not stop there. It had populated their world with others, people Lena believed had existed outside the farm. The librarian with her mechanical stiffness, the gas station attendant with his strange stillness, the pastor whose presence had always felt both comforting and alien, the grocery store clerk whose denim overalls now seemed less ordinary than they should have been. Every single one of them was a construct. Every one of them animated just enough to sustain the illusion of a world beyond the farm. There was no town. There had never been a town, not as she had imagined it. Buildings remained, shells of human habitation, left to rot after foreclosure and abandonment. But the interactions, the errands, the fleeting kindnesses of strangers were all illusions. Even Lena's own experiences of venturing beyond the farm were fabrications, orchestrated by the corn to keep her tethered to its dominion. The isolation was absolute. The corn's influence extended only as far as it needed to maintain its delicate lives. Beyond its reach lay emptiness, miles of barren farmland, cracked highways that could lead to distant cities filled with real people and real life. But inside its radius, every breath, every perception, every interaction was calculated, curated, enforced. Even the wind that whispered through the stalks seemed purposeful, nudging her thoughts, guiding her gaze, shaping her feelings. And the farm was alive. Not alive in the sense of wood and brick, not alive in the sense of animals or insects, but alive in memory, in obsession, in the quiet, inexorable intelligence of the corn. It remembered the people it had consumed. It remembered the hands that had planted it, tended it, loved it, cursed it. And now it had made them present again, twisted and reformed into straw and burlap, shadows of existence animated by something older, something patient, something that would never let go. Every corner of the farmhouse, every crumbling floorboard, every cobwebbed window reflected not the present, but a history rewritten. And Lena was not merely a visitor. She was the latest thread woven into the corn's sprawling, endless design, the lives it had collected, the straw figures it had raised, the illusions it had perfected, all of it converged on her. She moved through the kitchen, mechanically yet with understanding, as if every motion had been rehearsed for decades she had never lived. And outside, the fields awaited, patient and whispering, ready to teach her the truth she had only begun to comprehend, that the farm and the corn that held it had always been alive, and it had chosen her. Only the farm and its scattered illusions, the library staffed by straw figures frozen mid-motion, the gas station where hollow hands operated the pumps, a church presided over by a scarecrow priest whose congregation existed only in suggestion. Time had lost all meaning here. Days blurred into nights, months slipped past years, and the two scarecrows that had called themselves Lena and Oscar had moved through the motions of life, waking, speaking, touching, pretending that they were more than straw wrapped in thread. But beneath the veneer, the material itself had rebelled. The straw had felt the falseness, had known it was being forced into a story it could not belong to. That was what the coughing had been. Not intrusion, not illness, but a desperate attempt at escape, a protest from something never meant to serve as a living being. Lena approached the window, her gaze sweeping across the endless corn. And there it was, a miraculous shift. The dead brown stalks of yesterday had awakened, transformed into vibrant green, leaves stretching toward the dim light as though sighing in relief. The scarecrows at their posts had slumped, no longer necessary now that the illusions had been stripped bare. In the barn, the form that had once called itself Oscar lay still, straw spilling from the wound she had inflicted. She observed the face, or what had been a face. The burlap had abandoned pretense, smooth and blank, devoid of features, serene in its emptiness. A single, impossible question remained. What now? The farm existed undeniably. The corn had grown for longer than memory could measure and would continue to grow regardless of whether scarecrows dreamed they were human. The debt had once been real, pressing, and urgent, yet the memories of bankers, papers, obligations, all of it had been fabricated, implanted to serve the corn's unfathomable need. For companionship, purpose, something to tend, something to believe, however briefly, that their tending mattered. Lena lowered herself to the kitchen table, feeling the subtle shift of straw within her. Where burlap met burlap, crude approximations of joints flexed beneath her hands. Memories she had thought were hers, childhood in Minneapolis, faces of her parents, her first kiss, her wedding day, were suddenly suspect. Had the corn stolen them from some unseen source, or had it simply invented them, extrapolated fragments into an entire false history? Did it matter anymore? Outside, the sun crept higher, casting a hesitant glow across the endless fields, the light brushing the barn and the slumped scarecrows. And Lena understood that life here had transformed into something beyond understanding. Something older than humans, older than memory, older even than the notion of living itself. She exhaled slowly, the weight of realization pressing on her chest, and for the first time she felt the corn's quiet patience around her, the sense that nothing ended, nothing truly left, that all existence was merely a layer in the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the farm. And in that knowledge, terrifying and inexorable, Lena began to feel a strange kinship with the straw, the burlap, the wind-rustling stalks. She was part of the farm now, or perhaps she always had been. The sun climbed higher, and the green corn whispered secrets older than any story she had ever known. And something deeper, something that felt almost like regret, carried on the whispering leaves. She stepped closer to the concentric rings of abandoned attempts. The scarecrows loomed in the dim green light, silent, skeletal silhouettes swaddled in rotting flannel shirts and sun-bleached jeans, faces stitched into neutral expressions that had never known breath. Some were slumped, others stood rigid, and a few leaned toward her as though listening, as though desperate. "You didn't mean to hurt us," she said softly, the realization landing in her chest like a slow, inevitable truth. This was the only way you knew to keep from being alone. The corn answered with a shiver of sound, a cascade of husks brushing one another like 1,000 sighs. She understood now. The horror wasn't cruelty, it was need, it was yearning. A field stretching farther than memory itself, abandoned by those who once tended it, left to think and grow and remember on its own. The intelligence that had awakened here had no experience with death, with time, with endings. It only knew cycles, planting, harvest, regrowth. So when the humans left, when their hands stopped tending the soil, the corn tried to grow its own caretakers. But it had no blueprint for souls. Lena walked between the failed bodies, trailing her hand along burlap arms, straw ribs, cloth torsos that had never lived. She felt a strange tenderness for them. They were siblings of a kind, fragments of a longing too immense to fully understand. Each one had been built with hope. Each one had disappointed in a way the corn had never meant. "You tried," she whispered. "You really tried." The corn rustled again, a question, a plea. "You want me to stay," she interpreted aloud, "to take my place among them." Her gaze swept the endless circles. If she stood still long enough, if she let the corn close around her, if she surrendered the last remnants of self the way Oscar had, she would become another figure in the cathedral of green. Another memory simulation, another placeholder for something the farm could not regain. She could return to the farmhouse, let the lie rebuild itself, let her mornings fill once more with percolator steam and soft footsteps, with routine and comfort and the warm illusion of a life she had never lived. It would be easier, so much easier. But straw that has known its nature cannot willingly return to dreaming. "I can't go back," she said, a tremor in her voice, not fear but acceptance. "I can't pretend anymore." The corn trembled, a rippling wave extending outward like a pulse. Sadness again, a gentle apology, even gratitude. Lena felt something shift within her, subtle yet absolute. The memories that weren't hers loosened their grip. Minneapolis blurred. Her parents' faces faded to silhouettes. The wedding day dissolved like mist. All that remained was the rustle of leaves, the scent of earth, the quiet heartbeat of the field. Her burlap skin tightened in a strange, grounding way. Her straw spine straightened. Her feet rooted, not stuck but anchored. "I won't be your lie," she murmured, "but I won't abandon you either." The corn listened. "I'll walk," she said, "beyond your reach, beyond your illusion. Maybe somewhere out there, something real still remembers this place. Maybe someone can come back." Another rustling wave, this time not sadness but acknowledgement, permission. She stepped away from the cathedral. The corn parted, reverent. The field stretched ahead in endless corridors of green, opening a path she'd never seen before, one that led outward, not inward. For the first time since gaining awareness, Lena felt direction, purpose, not imposed but chosen. She walked on, her burlap face unmasked, the sun warm against the woven fibers of her exposed skin. She no longer needed to pretend. She no longer needed the borrowed memories to feel whole. Behind her, the corn whispered like a prayer. Not a call to return, but a blessing for the journey. The afternoon sun filtered through the endless green, casting elongated shadows across the concentric rings of silent, waiting scarecrows. Lena moved among them, each step stirring the rustle of dry husks and brittle burlap. The field seemed alive with anticipation, yet it was not fear or anger that hung in the air, it was expectation. And beneath it all, a question that even the wind could not carry away. What now? The farm still existed. The corn still grew, taller and more patient than anything human hands could manage. Without a caretaker, it could only be itself, reaching skyward, pressing outward, stretching its roots into the deep, unknowable layers beneath the earth. And itself, the corn knew, was never enough. It longed for purpose, for connection, for recognition it could never fully grasp. For decades it had waited, silently rehearsing the forms and faces of what it thought life should be. Lena paused, letting her fingers brush against the stiff burlap of a nearby scarecrow. It yielded beneath her touch, straw shifting softly like breathless sighs. Her own body felt different now, no longer pretending to be human, no longer bound by the lies her mind had believed. Her burlap skin hung unevenly, some areas taut, some loose, as if finally accepting what she truly was. She could feel the straw inside settling, organizing itself without the need for fiction or pretense. She exhaled slowly, aware that each breath carried not just air, but understanding. The Brenners had left this place half a century ago, abandoning not only their home, but the very purpose that had once defined it. The corn had waited for them to return and never found them. It had grown wild, yes, but it had also grown aware. And what it sought was not simply existence, it had sought significance. Every scarecrow, every simulated human memory, every carefully constructed ritual had been an attempt to matter, to recreate what it had lost, to feel alive in the shadow of absence. They were not monsters. They were love letters, desperate, intricate, imperfect, written in straw and burlap. "I can't be what you need," Lena whispered into the rustling green. "None of us can. You're asking for something we were never meant to give." Her words were swallowed by the field, the cadence of leaves brushing against one another like murmured responses she could not quite translate. She knew it would not understand, not fully. The corn would continue to try to construct, to invest hope in form and motion and memory, and it would never succeed, but it would never stop attempting either. Then a different thought began to coalesce within her, emerging from the clarity of straw, from the part of herself that had never questioned its own nature. What if the corn didn't need humans at all? What if it only needed the illusion of purpose, the performance of tending? And if that were true, could scarecrows, aware of their own artificiality, provide it? Could being fully themselves, knowing themselves to be straw and burlap, be enough? Lena started walking toward the farmhouse. The corn shifted and swayed around her, questioning, attentive, almost waiting for an answer she did not have words to give. Words demanded certainty, she had none, but she felt the straw within her aligning with some new, unspoken intent, perhaps a decision, perhaps simply the next act that must be done. The path ahead was neither preordained nor clear, but it was hers, and for the first time she did not fear the walk. The farm could continue to whisper, to rustle, to dream, endless cycles. She could move forward aware of her own truth, aware that knowing herself was enough. The field parted before her, patient, patient as always, and Lena walked on, each step a quiet affirmation. She would no longer be alive, but she would not abandon the hope that had brought life, even in the smallest, most fractured way, to this relentless, patient, impossible corn. The barn yawned open under the fatting light, shadows stretching long across the worn floorboards. Inside, the form that had once been Oscar lay where Lena had left it, straw spilling like golden rain, but the frame unbroken, waiting. She knelt, her fingers brushing the loose fibers, picking up the scattered pieces with a care born of understanding rather than urgency. The needle rested nearby, thread still taut and willing. Her hands remembered the motions, or perhaps it was the straw itself recalling how to bind, how to weave, how to imitate life from the simplest of materials. Slowly, methodically, she reconstructed him. By evening, Oscar rose once more. No longer human, no trace of pretense on his burlap face. His form was articulated straw, clearly synthetic, yet there was something. Not a soul, not a person, but a presence. A vessel capable of standing in the field, fulfilling the need the corn demanded. The illusion of care, of cultivation, of tending. Lena stepped back, observing the work, feeling an odd satisfaction stir inside the hollow chest of straw that had become hers. Without a word, they walked together to the edge of the field. The other scarecrows waited, lined up like sentinels frozen in mid-conversation, the faces of townsfolk who had never been here staring blankly. Lena and Oscar collected each one, moving with the ease of long-practiced ritual, adding them to the congregation gathered in the field's heart. Each placement was precise, deliberate, an unspoken acknowledgement of what the corn needed to feel complete, even if complete would never truly arrive. Night fell cool and heavy, and they returned to the farmhouse, standing side by side on the porch. Eyes forward, they watched the corn rustle and sway, the green sea moving as though it were alive, aware of the vigil held over it. Every evening, Lena knew this would be their ritual, watching, tending, standing witness, until the straw rotted to nothing, until the weather tore them into their elemental parts, until the corn finally realized the impossibility of its own longing. And yet in this moment there was a strange peace. Lena, assembled from straw and memory fragments that had never belonged to her, understood herself fully. She was no longer pretending, no longer trapped in the illusion of humanity. She was a scarecrow, and that knowledge carried a freedom of its own. The corn whispered its eternal conversation, leaves brushing leaves in a language only patient, waiting things could comprehend. The farmhouse groaned with familiar complaints, settling into its rhythm, indifferent and eternal. She was watching over land that had never truly required watching, performing a task that had never truly needed performing, And in that paradox, she found something that was neither horror nor solace, but pure, patient existence. The long, endless waiting that corn understands instinctively, and that over time, scarecrows come to share. Spring would bring the foreclosure papers. The bank would claim the property. The corn would be plowed under. But for now, for this evening, Lena, who had never truly been Lena, stood among straw and shadows, fully herself, fully aware, and finally at rest in the impossible work of enduring. The farm had long since ceased to require anything from them. The wind stirred through the stalks, carrying whispers that belonged neither to earth nor to memory, and the stars reflected in the glassy eyes of the scarecrows, endless and indifferent. Lena shifted slightly, feeling the straw inside her settle fully, a quiet finality in the hollow that had once tried to believe itself human. The last echoes of her invented self, the one who thought she had a name, a past, a purpose, slipped away, leaving only the clarity of being what she was, straw, aware, unyielding, patient. The corn rustled with a rhythm all its own, brushing against itself in a language of waiting and desire. It did not demand her to be anything but present, to fill a void that could never be filled. And so she remained, as she always would, watching and listening and tending in the way that straw could, a silent witness to the impossible persistence of growth and memory intertwined. Night deepened, shadows lengthening across the broken barn and empty farmhouse. The other scarecrows, gathered in concentric rows in the field, seemed to breathe collectively, though no breath existed. Their faces, blank, stitched, fractured, were testimonies to attempts at life, at connection, at understanding a world that had moved on without them. Each tilt of a head, each subtle shift in posture, spoke of awareness too small to change anything, yet large enough to matter in its own quiet way. The horizon remained empty, the distant hills untroubled by human concern. And yet here, in the center of a field long abandoned by those who once tended it, existence had settled into a peculiar kind of order. Not peace, not victory, not tragedy, just enduring. Straw and corn and the slow patience of things that knew themselves fully, standing in a shared acknowledgement of emptiness and purpose entwined. Lena turned her gaze skyward, tracing constellations she had never learned, stars cold and impassive. Her joints did not ache, her heart did not pound. She felt only the completeness of her own awareness. The wind whispered again, brushing her burlap skin, stirring the loose fibers inside her. She understood at last. She was exactly what the farm required, exactly what the corn had waited for all these decades. Not human, not alive in the way memory insisted life must be, but a witness, a steward, a presence capable of sustaining a cycle that no living being could ever truly govern. And so she waited, and so she watched, and the corn, patient beyond reckoning, whispered back. Together, they endured in the quiet, eternal way of things that do not need to begin and do not require an end. The farmhouse settled into its familiar creaks and sighs. The stars wheeled overhead, and the farm continued as it always had, in its slow, impossible, perfect persistence. They had never truly lived, not in the way flesh and blood live, not in the way hearts beat and minds hope. And that is the true horror, stripped bare of theatrics, of ghosts, of the familiar tropes of fear. It is the recognition of your own hollowness, the acceptance of your own fabrication, the gut-deep realization that consciousness itself may be nothing more than a story we tell ourselves to endure the void. The corn had always understood this. In its quiet, relentless way, it had known the impossibility of being, the futility of matter and memory. And in trying to give that understanding shape, in attempting to make loneliness tangible, it had done something far worse than creating monsters, far worse than death, far worse than the fears that can be spoken aloud. It had crafted awareness of emptiness and bound it to forms of straw, hollow witnesses of a world they could never inhabit, aware of the meaning they could never grasp. This is where it ends, or rather, this is where it always ends. In a field that demands nothing, yet hosts the endless vigil of scarecrows, each animated by memories stolen from the dead, by echoes of lives that never truly were. The farmhouse stands, the corn grows, and the scarecrows remain. Neither alive nor dead, neither real nor unreal, neither human nor entirely inhuman. They are constructs fulfilling their design, standing watch with the patient inevitability of straw that has finally recognized itself. Nothing more, nothing less, only the corn, only the farm, only the endless vigil, a performance whose sole purpose is to fill the emptiness that meaning left behind. Time passes, seasons turn, yet the field remains. And in that waiting, there is a sort of dreadful completeness. They will stand until entropy itself swallows memory, until even the universe forgets that corn ever grew, that farms ever existed, that scarecrows ever watched. And still, until that moment comes, they stand. And standing is enough. It must be enough, for there is nothing else.